What's up, guys? We'll speak about pawn islands, the importance of the pawn islands in the endgame, and not just the endgame. It matters very much also to avoid creating the pawn islands at any moment, because pawn islands are very difficult to being effectively defended. Okay, so in this position here, let's just look at the practicality of the situations here. For instance, white has three pawn islands, namely a2, b2. Okay, fair enough. An isolated pawn and a pawn island on d3. That's not very good. That's probably the least happy white pawn. And another pawn island on g3 and h3. Fine. Now, black is doing a little bit worse here because black is having four pawn islands, and those three also are disconnected, are isolated pawn. Because pawn islands already are disconnected, pawns from the main chain, but here they are also isolated pawns, therefore easier for white to target them. Okay, let's just give you an example here. The intention for the white knight that's just been played to d4 is to go to c6 and target two weaknesses at the same time. Both black pawns targeted are disconnected and easy to be attacked, and more difficult for black to try to keep them alive. Now, of course, king f7 tries to defend at least this guy here, and the plan would be after knight c6 to push a6. But hey, there is a plan that you could play with white and actually make this guy very much vulnerable, with starting with the very shrewd b4 pawn move, which means they will not be able to actually moving downwards, and all you have to do is chase with the knight one more time, and this guy is going to be captured. Okay, so obviously white is doing better, winning in this position here. Let's have a look at another example here. So that's that type of mistake that probably beginners or intermediate players are more likely to do it. White played knight to c3, and you know, you want to get your knight into the game, but I'm not quite sure that this is the most ideal move for the white knight, because black simply now takes the white knight, and what's the consequence of it? Well, the pawn on c3 is an isolated pawn. Pawn on a2 is isolated, okay? So those guys now will have to be defended by the rook when the black rook attacks them, because there is no other pawn to offer protection for those pawns. They've been disconnected by the previous move, knight c3 of whites. Now we can just simply speculate, go exploit your opponent's weaknesses, and just move something like rook a8 to c8, and very difficult for white to managing defending them both. Now after this rook lift, do you know what's coming? It's something like, for instance, rook a4, targeting the other guy, because the other pawn on a2 is also isolated pawn, and you have to use the rook, and you won't be quite able to defend both white pawns. And if I add into this also the black king itinerary, that will be incredibly difficult for white to survive with those pawns being targeted by the rook potentially and by the black king that moves closer. Okay, so black is doing better here. You're supposed to be winning. In this position here, black is having two pawn islands, g6, f5, c5, and b6, and they are connected, and that's nice and it's cool. Now, unfortunately for white, it's four pawn islands, and they are all isolated pawns. Isolated, 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 isolated. So they are all targetable and very difficult to defend. And so you just take advantage. You're attacking this guy here. They defend, but hey, don't matter. You're going to play rook to c3, and you're attacking now the c4 white pawn. Very difficult in the... How are you going to protect that guy? It's very difficult. And even if you think of moves like to h4, just, you know, you're going to keep attacking, going to keep hitting, and something's going to fall at some point. This guy also looks incredibly shaky, and already black is winning here, provided you're not playing bigger blunder than your opponent. Let's look at this subtlety now, the new exercise, bishop to e5. Now, you are supposed to take this bishop straight away. The question is, and you can pause it for 2 or 3 seconds, what piece would be very much ready to take it back. Which one is the wisest move for black to play here? Would you take with the pawn or would you take with the knight? There is a big difference. You could take with the knight, but you have to accept that you have a huge liability on d6, the black pawn on d6, attackable by rooks, for instance, and you're going to have then to use other rook, and it's just simply not looking good. They will be ganging up on your weakness. Whereas if you take with the pawn, you actually create the pawn chain. This guy is connected with this and this and this. At any point you could play f6 and that pawn is nice and safe. Okay, so always important, this kind of subtleties, they do matter so much. So broadly speaking, ladies and gents, try to keep your pawns connected, avoid disconnecting them, avoid having yourself pawn islands, and try to generate to your opponents this kind of pawn structures, which definitely are favorable to the person with them having connected. Let's look at the next exercise here. Again, can you create to your opponent this kind of fracture, this kind of isolated pawn type of structure? Of course you can. Now, you might be saying, okay, should I take the knight or should I take the bishop? Let's just think about this one. Which one generates an isolated pawn for black? And probably you found it already. You take the bishop, king can't take it because check from the white rook, and they have to take with the pawn. Therefore, bingo, you've created the weakness, attackable and exploitable later on in the game. Can't take with the king, they will have to take with the pawn. Okay, this one here, would you take with the pawn on d3 or with the rook on c4? Very important, very important little detail towards the end of the game. Now, probably it's easy understandable now. The best stuff would be take with the rook, not with the pawn, because if you take with the pawn, you are creating another isolated pawn, and practically you're going to have 1, 2, 3 isolated pawns. You definitely don't want to have this kind of stuff. Therefore, you're taking back with the rook, activating the white rook. The rook now is on the C file, happy and powerful. You keep those two white pawns connected. These guys are connected. Yeah, it doesn't look very good, this A2 isolated pawn, but it's slightly equal. The position here is slightly equal. And indeed, if you endeavor to attack, for instance, on A4, there is always an antidote to whatever you try to attack. It's very much defendable indeed. So the position is relatively equal, but it's important for you to not worsen your condition. Okay, so in the previous situation, important for you is to take with the rook so that you avoid creating another isolated pawn. Let's go for this position here now, and I think you guys already got a hang of it. Would you take with the knight or would you capture back with the pawn on c7 to d6? Which one do you think is the best advisable move here? And probably you guys found it. Is c7 taken on d6? Two connected pawns opens up the c file for the rook, potentially after the knight on c6 had played somewhere, and is way better to do this. You're not retreating a piece from attacking back to just do a recapture, but you take back with c7. Looks great, knight still attacking. No pawns to challenge the black knight on f5. Black rook again hits potentially on the c file, c3, and is very nice. Black is doing slightly better here, and I actually like having the black pieces in this scenario. Okay, let's try another one. Perhaps the last exercise here. How can we generate the weakness for white in this position here? Of course, you could come up with many tactical ideas, strategical ideas actually. It's not that much of a tactic now, but just strategy happening right before our eyes. How can we create a bit of a weakness here? And probably you found it. That would be bishop to h6, because the bishop on e3 is pinned, and after bishop h6, definitely you will be exerting like quite a nice pressure here. So let me just play bishop h6. The idea being we are able to create an isolated pawn, okay, on the e file. A king tries to move away from the pin, but hey, I'm still going taking this guy. King can't take because check from the rook, therefore they must take with the pawn, and that's an isolated pawn. And it does matter. It does matter because it's more attackable, more exploitable, and isolated isolated, isolated. Better pawn structure for black here, weaker for white, and thus easier for black to attack them. So that's an important principle, ladies and gents, especially in the endgame. Avoid having yourselves isolated pawn, and if possible, try to create isolated pawns for your opponents. Okay, so that was about the pawn islands. Okay, those groups of one or maybe two pawns disconnected of the same color, pawns of the same color disconnected from other pawns. Try to avoid them having yourselves and try and generate them to your opponents. Good luck to your games. See you soon.